This video was brought to you by Ground News. On Sunday, Venezuela had a referendum asking voters whether or not they approved of the idea of incorporating the disputed territory of Essequibo, which accounts for roughly 2/3 of neighboring Guyana, into Venezuela as a new state. According to Venezuela's electoral authorities, over 95% of respondents approved of the idea. So the big question now is whether or not Venezuela will take military action to claim the territory and its copious offshore oil reserves. So in this video, we're going to explain why Venezuela is suddenly so interested in the territory. Hint, it's about oil, as well as Sunday's referendum and what might happen next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, the first thing we should say is that we've already done videos on both Guyana's recent oil boom and this topic specifically. So go and watch those videos if you want to know more, especially about the history of this dispute. But the TLDR is that since the 19th century, Venezuela and Guyana have been arguing over Essequibo, 160,000 square kilometers of dense rainforest that lies at the west of Guyana's Essequibo River. As with many territorial disputes, the origins of the disagreement lie in the colonial era. When the Dutch handed over Guyana to the British in 1814, they didn't properly define the western boundary of the area, but Britain effectively administered most of Essequibo. In 1840, though, the British redrew the map so that their new territory included the entirety of Essequibo, and Venezuela responded by laying claim to the entire area as well. Then, in 1899, the International Arbitration Tribunal ruled largely in favour of the UK. But while Venezuela originally accepted the ruling, in 1962 they changed their minds, rejecting this decision. Then, in 1966, Venezuela and the UK agreed on a dispute resolution process which was to be mediated by the UN. And when Guyana became independent soon after, they took responsibility for these negotiations. For the next 60 years or so, Guyana continued to administer the territory, and while Venezuela didn't formally withdraw its claim to the territory, they basically left Guyana alone. However, the dispute restarted in the late 2010s after oil was discovered off the Guyanese coast, especially around Essequibo. The first significant discovery of Guyanese oil was by ExxonMobil back in 2015, and since then, the small South American country has become an oil hotspot after a series of further discoveries. And as a result, Guyana now has estimated reserves of over 11 billion barrels, the fourth largest reserves per capita anywhere around the world, after just Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE. As a result, Guyana currently produces approximately 40,000 barrels of oil per day, but expects to ramp up production to 1.3 million barrels per day by 2027, which would make it one of the top 20 oil producers globally. Unsurprisingly, this has done phenomenal things for Guyana's economy, and during the pandemic, when basically every other economy was shrinking, Guyana's GDP essentially tripled. Unfortunately for Guyana, a lot of this oil lies off the coast of Essequibo, and this has apparently renewed Venezuela's interest in the territory. Now, the Venezuelan government know that if they can claim Essequibo, then they'll also get to claim some of the oil, because it would expand Venezuela's so-called exclusive economic zone to cover these new oil reserves. Now, the most significant escalation of this dispute came in September, when Venezuela's National Assembly greenlit a multi-question referendum on this issue, with the last question asking Venezuelans if they agree with integrating Essequibo as a Venezuelan state. Now, this obviously didn't go down too well with Guyana, who accused Venezuela of preparing an annexation, and tensions flared yet higher a few days ago when Venezuelan troops were redeployed around the border, allegedly to carry out operations against illegal mining. All of this provoked an angry reaction not just from Guyana, which saw the deployment as a pretext for invasion, but also Brazil, which responded by boosting its own military presence in the region. Anyway, despite the fact that the International Court of Justice warned against the vote, On Sunday, the vote went ahead after the Venezuelan president took to X to encourage Venezuelans to vote to reclaim what he described as their homeland. And, well, according to the official results, that's basically what happened. Venezuela's National Electoral Council claimed that more than 10.5 million ballots were cast in a country of 20 million eligible voters, and that over 95% of respondents voted in favor of all 5 questions, including the one on essentially annexing Essequibo. Now, these results should be taken with a massive pinch of salt, not least because Venezuela isn't exactly known for the integrity of their elections, and these majorities are implausibly large, but also because journalists reported seeing very few voters actually at polling booths. Nonetheless, in the immediate aftermath, Maduro claimed that the vote was the first step of fighting for what is ours, and military action now obviously looks a lot more likely. Before the vote, Venezuela's defense minister ominously warned that the conflict is not an armed war for now, and the Venezuelan army released a frankly pretty amateur-looking video declaring their readiness to support the results of the referendum. And if Venezuela does decide to claim the territory by force, then there's not much that Guyana can do by themselves. Guyana is a tiny country with a population of less than 1 million, or roughly 4% of that of Venezuela. It's never really fought a war in its history, and doesn't even really have a functioning army. This is why a lot depends on Guyana's South American neighbors, especially Brazil and the US. Let's start with Brazil. While Bolsonaro was staunchly anti-Venezuela, Lula has adopted a more balanced approach, and Brazilian intervention against Venezuela looks unlikely. When it comes to the US, the picture is a bit more complicated. On the one hand, the Biden administration wants to pursue better relations with Venezuela in order to encourage the country to hold democratic elections next year, which might discourage Biden and co. from taking too strong a line against Venezuela. The US also wants to bring down global oil prices, which is why it loosened oil sanctions on Venezuela a couple of months ago, on the condition that Venezuela make preparations for next year's elections. On the other hand, the US has historically proved to be pretty willing to intervene in South America in order to defend its strategic interests. And on Sunday, a US Army representative described Guyana as an important democratic partner. Ultimately, though, direct US involvement looks unlikely, and perhaps the most likely US response will be a reintroduction of sanctions on Venezuelan exports, including oil. But even this will be a marked failure for the Biden administration, which has been desperately trying to bring down global oil prices in the face of continued production cuts from OPEC+. With bilateral relations in the dumps, Biden has been unable to coax Saudi Arabia into increasing production and has resorted to increasing domestic production and striking tenuous deals with sanctioned oil producers like Venezuela in order to loosen global supply. So, if he reintroduces sanctions only a few months after loosening them, or if the loosening is seen as encouraging Venezuela's recent aggression, the policy will go down as a failure, especially if the reintroduction of sanctions fail to deter Venezuelan aggression. Now, this Venezuelan referendum has been covered extensively by almost 100 outlets. 43% of this reporting is coming from the left, while 27% is coming from the right. And if you compare the headlines, you'll see some interesting framing emerging. And this is all possible thanks to our sponsor, Ground News, a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. That's because every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. For example, for the story we mentioned earlier, you can see the bias distribution of every outlet reporting on it, the complete factuality information, and the ownership data. And with their new Bias Insights feature, you can even get a breakdown of the specific differences between left and right reporting. And I especially like their My News Bias feature, which allows you to track your reading habits over time. You can view your own personal biases, from specific news outlets and political lean to specific topics and locality. I can even see who owns the majority of news that I consume. Now, I know that I personally benefited enormously from ground news, and as a result, I've gotten much better at spotting political bias, and I've surprisingly challenged some of my own views. So I highly encourage all of our viewers to give ground news a try. In fact, we're offering 30% off their Vantage plan to all viewers. This includes unlimited access to every feature, including to My News Bias. That offer is only available here too, so make sure that you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started for under $6 a month.